Welcome back. Now we're spawning some spheres and they look great, but I would really like to be able to pick them up. And that's going to happen before they wink out of existence and destroy themselves. Right now, they destroy themselves after 2 seconds, and I kind of want a longer time than that. So I'm going to go to my small sphere and take a look at my lifetime. It's 2 seconds. I'm going to set that to 4 for now. And we'll go back to our sphere spawner, and I'm going to set the spawn time to a longer time. Let's say 2 seconds, maybe 2.5. We'll use 2.5. So during the few seconds that these spheres live, I want to be able to go up to it and grab it. I want to overlap with it with our default pawn and, well, make it wink out of existence early. And then later we can figure out how to keep some kind of a score, keep track of how many of these we've picked up. But for now, we just need to detect whether our pawn has overlapped with the sphere. And to do that, we're going to add a new kind of component to our small sphere. We're going to add a sphere component. A sphere component is not a mesh. It's an overlap volume. And they exist in different flavors, different shapes. Now, we can select our sphere mesh and click Add and search for sphere. And you can see that under basic shapes, there's a sphere. That's a static mesh. The tooltip tells you that. We don't want a mesh. We already have a mesh. We want sphere collision. This is a sphere used for collision. And we'll learn more about collision and overlaps and how they work in detail. But for now, we just want this working. We want to get a sphere collision. And we can call this sphere volume. Now, the sphere volume is attached to the sphere mesh, which is the root. But there's a problem because we're scaling this root component, which is our sphere mesh, with timelines. And let me show you what happens to any component that's attached to the root when the root scales itself. If we go over to our scale, and I do have the lock locked, if it's locked, then if I change one component, they all change by the same amount. And as I'm scaling the sphere mesh up, look at the sphere volume. It's scaling up along with it. Now, that's not what I want. I want the sphere volume to always be the same size, even when our sphere mesh has its scale altered, because it will be altered with those timelines, right? So I'm going to click the curved arrow and set that back to its default scale. And I'm going to want our root component to be a different component from the sphere mesh. Now, one way to do that is to make the sphere volume the root component. If we drag it onto the sphere mesh, now the sphere volume is the root component. And the sphere mesh itself, if we change its scale, it's not changing the scale of the sphere volume. But let's go look at our event graph and see if that breaks anything. When we're calling scale sphere, notice we're setting world scale 3D for the sphere mesh itself and not the sphere volume. We're not setting the actor scale, we're setting the scale for just the sphere component. So that looks good. And if we go to our other timeline, we're doing the same thing here as well. So as our timeline sets the scale for the sphere mesh, it will not affect our sphere volume, which is our root component. Now, the sphere volume can be seen here in the viewport, but it's hidden in game. So if we go and play test and take a look, we can't see the sphere volume for those spheres. It's hidden, but we can change that setting for debug purposes. We can take our sphere volume and search for the rendering section in the details panel. If we find that, we'll see that we have both visible, which if we uncheck, we no longer see that volume. That's for being able to see it in general, whether in the game or in the editor. And then there's hidden in game. If we uncheck that, it will not be hidden in game. So hidden in game is specific to when we're playing the game. If we press play, we can see those spheres. If we see them begin to get spawned, there they are. And we can see that the spheres themselves, those sphere volumes, don't change their scale. Only the mesh is changing its scale. And you can also kind of see, based on those sphere volumes, what the orientation looks like when we spawn those in. Pretty cool. So these sphere volumes are not changing their size, which is what we want. I'm going to recheck hidden in game for now, so we can't see it in the game. And why did we bother doing all this? Well, because our sphere volume is going to overlap with our default pawn. As soon as our default pawn runs into it, we want something to happen. So back to our event graph, we're going to make that happen with an overlap event. And we have to assign an event to our sphere volumes overlap delegate. Now, what is that delegate called? Well, if we get our sphere volume and drag off and search for onComponentBegin, there's onComponentBegin overlap. Now, we've seen before that the assign is going to create a custom event and automatically name it for us. That's what assign does. If we click on assign, there's our new custom event. It's called onComponentBegin overlap event. Kind of generic. We can rename it though. We can say onSphere overlap, for example. That's what assign does, but let's take a look at those other options now, since we've already gotten experience with the assign option. I'm going to drag off and type onComponentBegin overlap. And let's see what happens if we choose bind. I'm going to get that one. Well, this is kind of half of the assign. It's just the blue bind node. So bind is going to allow us to bind an event, but we'd have to go and create our own custom event and hook that up here. But look, it doesn't work. Why? Because onComponentBegin overlap can only bind a custom event that has a set of specific parameters. And that's because when our sphere overlaps with something, it's supposed to pass this information along. What was the overlapped component? What was the other actor that got overlapped? And so on. So if we took our custom event and we added all these parameters to it, it would then be compatible to be bound to onComponentBegin overlap. But that's a lot of work to do, and Unreal Engine is smart enough to know that that's probably what you're going to want to do with this bind node. So it has the assign version that creates the custom event for you for onComponentBegin overlap. There's a couple other options as well. There's unbind event from onComponentBegin overlap, which means you no longer want that custom event to fire in response to an overlap event. You can unbind it by specifying the event and hooking it in there. That's another thing we can do. And the other option for onComponentBegin overlap is to unbind all events. This doesn't require you to specify which event. It just unbinds all events from onComponentBegin overlap. So onComponentBegin overlap is this entity that belongs to our sphere volume. And we call that a delegate, and we can bind events to that delegate that are supposed to be executed in response to the delegate being what we call broadcast. So when our overlap sphere overlaps with something else, then our onComponentBegin overlap delegate broadcasts, and our custom event that's bound to it and any other events bound to that delegate are executed. Okay, so that's a little bit more detail about overlap events. Now, this custom event will not be bound to onComponentBegin overlap unless some flow of execution reaches this node. Well, let's look at BeginPlay. BeginPlay has a sequence of nodes being executed, including setting a timer. Well, we can continue this string to our binding here so that on BeginPlay, onSphere overlap, our custom event, will be bound to our sphere volumes onComponentBegin overlap delegate. Let's just test this out and see if it works. First of all, by printing a string. I'm going to use print string. And what would I like to print? I'd like to print the other actor that we overlapped with. I'm going to use get object name so that we can get that name and print it to the screen with a debug message. Let's see what happens if we start overlapping some of these spheres with the default pawn. There's one. Got it. And we printed default pawn. Notice also that our default pawn is colliding with the mesh. That's not exactly what I want, but we're overlapping with that sphere and getting that message printed to the screen, which means that our overlap event that we bound is working. So we're going to want to do some things in response to being overlapped, but I also don't want to bang into that sphere mesh with my default pawn. And this brings us to a very important topic that we're going to dive deeper into very soon, and that is Unreal Engine's collision system. With my sphere mesh selected, I can go into the details panel and I can scroll down until I find a section called collision. And here is where we configure our collision presets for this given component. Now, there's a lot here, but all you need to know for now is if you don't want that sphere mesh colliding with anything, you don't want it to block things, you want things to just go past it, float right through it, you can change this collision presets dropdown to no collision. And now if we go and try to bang into one of these spheres, let's see if I can find one. Here we go. Notice that it's not blocking me. I can pass straight through it, no problem. So now we're not bumping into that mesh. It has no collision. And don't be scared, but there's a whole lot of other settings here for collisions, and we're going to get into that soon. But for now, no collision means don't bump into anything, don't generate any events when it hits or overlaps, just ignore everything. But the sphere volume, on the other hand, is a little different. If we select that and look for its collision settings, under the collision category, we have collision presets, and we can expand that dropdown. It does not say no collision. If we set this to no collision, well, then we won't even get that overlap event. Right now, it's overlap all dynamic. If it were no collision, then when we overlap, nothing happens. But I'll set it back to what it was, overlap all dynamic. So Unreal Engine has a relatively complex system for its collision settings. And one additional setting that I'll point out before we move on is this one, generate overlap events. This is a Boolean variable. It's set to true because the checkbox is checked. If we uncheck that, then we will also not get overlap events when we overlap with the spheres because they are no longer generating overlap events. So on component begin overlap no longer works. That's another thing to check for if your overlap events aren't working. Check your sphere volume and see if generate overlap events is checked. It should be if you want overlap events. So that's another thing to be aware of. Okay, so we've proven that our overlap events are working with our print string node. What do we really want to happen? Well, I'd like our wink out timeline to start. I'd like to find my wink out timeline. Here it is. And I'd like to start that timeline, scale the sphere down, and then destroy the actor at the end of it. I'd like that to happen. So I'm going to call wink out over here in response to an on-sphere overlap. Only I don't want this to be called in response to an overlap with just anything. I don't want two spheres to overlap with each other and wink each other out. That would be kind of cool, but that's not what I want. I want to call wink out only if we've overlapped with the default pawn. So we know for one thing we want to call wink out, right? So we can call that. But we only want to do this if the other actor is a default pawn. Well, we can check to see if it is a default pawn. We've seen that through inheritance, pawns are actors, but not all actors are pawns. We can check to see if it is a pawn. In fact, there's a function. If we drag off of other actor and type is a, here's a utility called is a. Pop-up says, returns whether or not the object passed in is of or inherits from the class type. So if we select that, we can filter by a class. For instance, pawn, just the base pawn class, there it is. And this will return a Boolean, true or false. If it is a pawn, it'll be true. If it's not a pawn, it'll be false. And these small spheres are not pawns. Remember, there's only one pawn in this particular game. That's the default pawn, right? So we can use this branch, we can hook it up, and if the other actor is a default pawn, then I would like to wink out. So let's play test this. Let's see if we can start that wink out animation. There it is. And if I'm flying too fast, we kind of just fly past it, right? We don't actually see that wink out unless we go up really close, but then we can see it. So in order to start that wink out animation sooner, I'm going to take my small sphere and increase the sphere radius. I'm going to take my sphere volume, and I'd like to increase it, but here's the problem. If I increase the scale, I'm also increasing the scale of the sphere mesh. So this is the type of situation where we would like a root component that is not the sphere volume and not the sphere mesh, but a simple scene component that these two are attached to. So I can click Add, I can type Scene, add a scene component, and call this, I'm going to call it Scene Root. I'm going to move it onto sphere volume, so it's now the root. And now my sphere mesh doesn't have to be attached to sphere volume. I want it attached to scene root. So instead of make new root, I'm going to choose attach. So now we have one root and a sphere mesh attached to the scene root and a sphere volume attached to the scene root. I don't want the sphere volume attached to the mesh. I don't want the mesh attached to the sphere volume. I want both of them attached to the scene root itself. And now I can scale up my sphere volume to a larger radius. Now, when scaling up a sphere volume, this type of component called sphere collision, I do not want to adjust the scale. I've been playing with it here. That's why it's not 1, 1, 1. I'm going to hit the curved arrow to make it 1, 1, 1, because the scale is not what you alter with these volumes. In the case of a sphere collision object, we go down to the shape category and we expand the sphere radius. Why? Because our scale can continue to be set to 1. We don't have to change the scale. We're only changing a property called sphere radius, which means if I really wanted to, my sphere volume could still be the scene root. Just to prove that, I'm going to replace the scene root with the sphere volume. And look at that. My mesh is not big, but I'm going to Control Z that because I do still want a scene root and I want my sphere volume to just be bigger. So keep that in mind. You don't change the scale of a sphere collision. You change its sphere radius. And I'm going to change it to about 250, so it's bigger. And now when we run into them from farther away, we'll trigger the overlap event sooner so we can actually see that wink out. And it might not quite be large enough. I'm going to take my sphere volume, find rendering, or just search for hidden in game, and uncheck hidden in game so I can see how big it really is. There they are. So I think I'd like them to be a bit bigger. So I'm going to take that sphere volume and take the sphere radius and set it to 500. They're nice and big. This might be too big, but we're going to be coming at them quite quickly. Okay, I don't want it to be much bigger than that. So in order to see it wink out faster, I'm going to go to my wink out timeline. I have it up here. I can always find it from my event graph and double click it to open it. And this takes 0.25 seconds, but I'd like it to take less time. Let's say 0.1 seconds. So I need to make my length for my timeline 0.1. And I'd like to, while I'm at it, change the shape of the curve. Why not? I'll give it a little bit of an overshoot so it'll get a little bigger and then wink out of existence. Let's see how this looks. There we go. It's happening faster. In fact, I like that overshoot. I'm going to make it overshoot a little more by taking my first handle and allowing it to go up like that. and then go down. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, that looks nice. That's some good juice there. All right, cool. So our overlap events are working, but I want to point out something important here. Our small spheres have their lifetime, right? We're setting a timer, and after our lifetime, which is 4 seconds, we start the wink out timeline. Well, we also have another circumstance where we start the wink out timeline, calling our wink out event, and that's if we've overlapped with a pawn. Well, what happens if a sphere has already started a wink out timeline, and then we overlap with it? Well, we'll start the wink out timeline again, and it'll look kind of jittery. It's really hard to reproduce this issue because it's so rare and the timeline is so quick, but it's possible. We might be in the middle of this timeline when an overlap event happens, and we start wink out again. So we want to prevent that from happening. We want to know if we're winking out currently. In other words, as soon as the wink out event is called, I'd like to set some kind of variable that we can check to make sure we don't start the timeline if we're already in the timeline, if we're already playing it. So I'm going to add a variable to my blueprint, and I'm going to call this isWinking. I'm going to compile that. Now, I don't need to set it to true. I want it to be false by default. But as soon as we call wink out, I want to set it to true. But I only want to do this wink out business if we're not already winking. So I need to make some room here because I'm going to expand upon what's happening. So let's make some room and make this comment bigger, because what I want to do when wink out is called is first place a branch to check isWinking. Now, the very first time, isWinking will be false because it starts off as false. So when wink out is called, if isWinking is true, which it won't be the first time, we're now going to set it to true. So I'm going to hold Alt and click and drag it out to get a set node. And in the false case, I'm going to set it to true. So we call wink out, we check isWinking. The first time it will be false, but we're going to set it to true, and then we're going to play the timeline, hooking this up to play. Now, if it gets called again, it's going to check isWinking, and it'll now be true. And so we won't start the timeline. Instead, we'll do nothing here. That's the behavior I want. All right, straightening the nodes here. I'm going to highlight the 4 of them actually, and hit Q to straighten them out. There we go. So this way, we can only wink out once, ever. We'll never set isWinking back to false. If it ever winks out once, then while it's winking out, it will never wink out again. We'll never start the timeline while we're already playing it. We'll never interrupt it, in other words. So that's a nice check to make sure we don't have any unintended buggy behavior. Okay, and when making changes like that, it's important to always play test and make sure that they work, and it looks like they do. So now we have these pickups that we can pick up, and they can wink out of existence. And if we don't pick them up, after 4 seconds, I expect to see it wink out anyway. There it goes. There goes that one, and there goes that one. So now our small spheres have a sphere volume. It's a sphere collision type object designed to overlap with things, designed to handle collisions. They're designed to be invisible in the game, which means sphere volume in the details panel has a hidden in game. Now I unchecked it so we can see it for debug purposes, but now that we've developed it, we're done. I'm going to recheck hidden in game, and now we don't have to see that pesky sphere anymore. Excellent job, and I'll see you soon.